All right, music fans, welcome back. Harmless Dave here, talking real music in real time for real people just like you and just like me. So, the lingering animosity between Jimmy Page and Phil Collins from Live Aid, 1985. Um, I don't know what it is. There are a lot of people out there that don't like Phil Collins for some reason who've worked with Phil Collins. And I don't think Phil Collins deserves that. I think he was the biggest thing in the 1980s. He just was, whether solo or with Genesis. Led Zeppelin does this Live Aid reunion. I remember going to the house of one of our best friends from the radio station. We all kind of hung out together, and she had this nice place out in Chatham, or her parents did, and it was a big deal. We carved out an entire day just to watch TV, just to watch Live Aid. We were just fixated on this. And I remember Mark Goodman from MTV just going out of his mind, talking about this is the greatest thing ever. Led Zeppelin, they're going to reunite. Phil Collins gets off the Concorde, shows up, and it was a disaster. It was kind of a disaster. We didn't know that it was going to be the disaster it turned out to be, and we were still enthralled with seeing Led Zeppelin essentially reuniting. Now, the problem for Zeppelin is, how do you replace the late, great John Bonham? Collins is not John Bonham. His style is very different. Collins is progressive and technical and is, he invented a whole lot of sounds in the 80s to kind of give him a signature sound, especially on records. I mean, it's Phil Collins. He had these little fills that he did, no pun intended for Phil Collins. And those fills were expected. You expected to hear those little rolls and fills that he did. John Bonham was just a beast. And, the beginning of rock and roll is classic John Bonham, and Jimmy Page is like, hey, he just can't even get this right. Again, we find out there was literally no rehearsal for Phil Collins. He wanted to get up there and wing it. He had Tony Thompson up there with him. So it was like they had all of this drumming power, and some of it didn't work all that well. But to Phil Collins's point about just getting up there and doing it, he was told that he might work with Plant, he might work with a couple of these people. When he gets there, he's involved in this full-blown Led Zeppelin reunion. So I think he was a little bit misinformed, or he didn't have all the information. He listened to Stairway to Heaven, apparently, on the Concorde to make sure he could get that right. Again, another difficult song to play. I'm not excusing Phil Collins, but you've got two drummers and you've got a very rusty Led Zeppelin. You've got Robert Plant not singing at his best. Again, he's 5 years removed from Zeppelin, and vocally speaking, Plant's teetering a little bit. I mean, he can still do all this stuff. I actually went to see Robert Plant in, I want to say 1988, and that was the Now and Zen tour. And he was still, getting his voice into the rafters in a way that he did during the 1970s. It was really impressive that he could still pull that stuff off. But that was short-lived. I mean, because that is just ridiculous material to be singing, for 20 years. And his voice matured, and a lot of people like kind of the softer, quieter version of Plant, but you're singing rock and roll is a difficult song to sing out of the box. And the band obviously didn't rehearse enough, and it just seemed a little hodgepodge. If you're going to do the legendary reunion, everybody should have rehearsed. They should have gotten this down so well that they were confident when they got up there. Collins wanting to wing it, I think, is probably more because he was over in the United States, and then he has to go. He literally jumped on the Concorde, if you remember, and that was a big dramatic thing. MTV was following, like the Concorde landed, and here comes Phil Collins, and everybody was like, wow, this is going to be epic. You know, he was on 2 continents in one festival, and that's what made Live Aid just a really special thing for somebody who was, you know, in their teens and 20s at the time. They're watching rock history. We were all a little bit more enthusiastic about the more current bands that were showing up at the time for Live Aid versus, you know, Led Zeppelin, the dinosaur band. But we were all very much intrigued by this reunion and Phil Collins taking part of it. And look, Phil Collins played on Robert Plant's Principle of Moments. He might have been on the Pictures at 11 album as well. I can't remember. But you think he would have, you know, some good sense up there on drums. Rock and roll, very difficult song to play. You're not John Bonham. Nobody is John Bonham. Jason is the closest thing. And Jason obviously was way too young at that moment to play drums for Led Zeppelin. Although by the end of the decade, he had his own band, you know, and I think even a couple of years later, a year or two later, he was in this band called Virginia Woolf. So it wouldn't have been out of the question maybe to bring him up there, but nobody thought that was a good idea. Ironically, Phil Collins' son, Nick, is on tour with him nowadays and doing just a fantastic job, just a great musician, really following in his dad's footsteps. What's weird is all this time later, these guys are still kind of talking smack about each other. And, you know, Jimmy Page was not on his game either that night. So there are a lot of things that kind of went wrong during that performance. People were still really happy to see Led Zeppelin. And I think many people even thought afterwards, maybe these guys will get back together again. Maybe they'll put Phil Collins on drums, but Phil did not endear himself to Jimmy Page, and it shows even today. So interesting stuff that these musicians, after all this time, can't just let the water go under the bridge, right? And just say, you know what? It is what it is. It still is a historic performance. It wasn't our best work, and maybe we should have convinced a few people to kind of come to the table here a bit. And maybe you don't get the drummer who just played in the United States to come off the plane, and maybe you just stick to one drummer. I think that might have been a better strategy overall. But again, it's all like Monday morning quarterbacking at this stage. And the performance still stands as a pretty amazing event, even though it didn't go off the way it should have. So who knows? Will these guys ever kind of just say, you know, whatever, it's not a big deal? Probably not, because Jimmy Page, you know, he thinks that his reputation was tarnished because of Phil Collins. Phil Collins has a different point of view, and, you know, they're both pig-headed and kind of stubborn, and that's the way it is. So there you have it. So yeah, check out that performance if you haven't ever seen it. We were all glued to the television for the entire day. It was just one of those things where you were like, okay, who's coming on next? And they built this up as the greatest reunion event in history. And it's pretty high up there when it comes to reunions. Pink Floyd did a reunion. That was kind of a big deal back in, I think it was 2008 or something like that. Might have been even further back than that. And that was kind of a big deal. The Zeppelin reunion. And then, of course, Zeppelin did get together again later on with Jason Bonham on drums one time for an event, from what I remember. It's sad because there was so much wasted time where, you know, even the 90s, where they knew Jason could play at that point, and they should have just cashed in, did a couple of live albums or something, and maybe recorded some new material. Might have been interesting, but Robert Plant is like, nope, we're done. That's it. And maybe that was the right thing to do. don't know. I know Zeppelin fans to this day think that the band probably could have soldiered on with Jason Bonham on drums, and I think he certainly could have done a good job. He's still doing a good job. He's out there with Sammy Hagar, so obviously he's still a quality musician, a highly respected musician, and maybe if he were a little older, he would have been playing drums at Live Aid. All right, that's the video done. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications, and don't forget about Patreon. Lots of Patreon comments. I'm trying to keep up with them, folks. Don't feel slighted if your comment isn't immediately addressed. It's a good problem to have, so I'm not complaining. I'm just letting you all know it might take me a while to get there. So see you soon.